Day zero is the moment before company formation, when a founder decides to take the plunge, follow their dream, and commit to pursuing their vision of change. On day zero, you'll hear founders tell their story. From the initial idea, through reactions by critics and skeptics, setbacks and successes, we'll cover it all. Behind every company is a founder with ambition, goals, dreams, and wisdom to be shared. Let's explore them together.
Well, good afternoon, Sandra and Brian. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having us, Gary.
We're pleased to have you at this microphone. Let's get to know you a bit better. I'd like to ask each of you, what was life like growing up? Brian, let's start with you.
So I am one of the rare souls who's actually both born and raised in Washington, D.C. And I grew up with two parents who were lawyers and who tried to convince me not to become a lawyer. But I didn't listen to them. And most of my time was spent playing sports growing up. I played baseball, basketball, soccer, football, and ran track.
You ran track at Yale, I think, Brian, right?
I did, and it turns out that I was fairly fast in the 400. So I ran at Yale for about 2 years, but unfortunately, my body caught up with me and realized that I was 150 pounds and I should not be running the 400.
Yeah, stamina, that's a good point. Well, so Sandra, Brian grew up in D.C. Where did you grow up and what was life like growing up for you?
Yeah, my childhood was the opposite of Brian's childhood. I grew up playing zero sports. I was not athletic in any sense of the word, picked probably last for every sports team, but I was very, very engaged in the arts. And so I was much more of a creative kid, and I did a lot of theater and a lot of plays, since a very young age. And that's where my passion was. But yeah, I grew up in Chicago in the first on the South Side in Hyde Park, and then later on in the north suburbs of Chicago.
This show is about leadership and sustaining leadership excellence. You're both terrific examples of that. What did you think about leadership when you were growing up in the early days? Brian, what did you think at all about leadership and all your activity in the sports fields?
For me, it began as a kid. I thought about leadership in two ways. Number one is what I saw around me in DC, which was people giving speeches, inspiring speeches, and moving people to act, or at least trying to. And number two is what I saw in the sports field, which was a good leader is someone who makes others around them be better than they would otherwise be.
What about you, Sandra? Obviously not on the ball field, but what did you think about leadership?
Yeah, I probably was not as keyed into leadership as a kid as Brian might have been. But I did spend most of my 20s in Washington, D.C., working on the Hill. I was a Hill rat, as they call us, and I, at a very young age, started working for a congressman, then a senator, and a cabinet secretary. And so basically, I sometimes think of my coming of age as happening in Washington, D.C., in politics. And of course, you know, from that viewpoint, leadership to me was, policy change and, concretely using legislation to make people's lives better.
So you each went to law school, Brian, Georgetown, Sandra to Northwestern. What were your aspirations for getting your law degrees?
I had always wanted to be a federal criminal prosecutor. So I was lucky enough to actually have that job for a few years immediately prior to my diagnosis. So that for me was the reason to go to law school in the first place. I did not go to law school to become a lawyer. In fact, what's interesting, Gary, I'm not sure if you know this, but I started out at Georgetown Law.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And when I was accepted into the night program there, my welcome video was a video, surprisingly, of a young Brian Wallach welcoming me to my new program, after which I called my boyfriend at the time and let him know that there was some video that was being used school-wide, and it was his. And Brian's reaction was, "Oh, that's great. I thought they were going to use that for a year." And, it turns out about 10 years later, Gary, they're still using Brian's Georgetown Law welcome video, which we're very flattered by.
Of course.
I ultimately went to law school because I had begun in a career in political communications, and I saw a lot of policy committee staff members with a degree in law that were leveraging that degree to be more focused on policy making. And so for me, that was an opportunity to pivot from communications into policy.
Well, the staff at Think Medium has absolutely committed me to ask the question, where and when did you two meet?
Yeah, we actually lived down the block from each other in 2008 in Washington, D.C., but we never met there. Yeah, we actually first met in Manchester, New Hampshire on the Obama campaign. And we met at a staff picnic where I remember... Oh no, what are you going to say? That Sandra showed up. And my first thought was what? Oh no. They're bringing in new people.
Brian was the deputy director. Weren't you the campaign there?
So in the primary, I was the deputy political director. And then I went back to New Hampshire for the general and became the political director. And that's where we met, on the general.
All right, very good. Well, thank you. The staff at Think Medium will be happy that they now know that, and it will be happy with me that I actually asked you the question. So,
well, Gary, they can call me anytime. I'm a consummate oversharer, and I can provide a lot more detail offline.
Okay.
I'm at the ready.
Good. Let's make sure it's offline. That's good, Sandra. Well, so in 2017, Brian learned that he was diagnosed with ALS. That was a circumstance that you'll never forget and has triggered off an enormous amount of action in a short period of time. But Brian, let me ask the question this way. What was your feelings over the first 6 to 12 months? I mean, you went through stages of feeling about this, but what was the mobilizing factor over that first 6 to 12 months in terms of your priorities and how you were thinking about life?
We actually were diagnosed the same day that Sandra and our youngest daughter came home from the hospital after just being born. So for me, there was a bit of time where I tried to ignore the diagnosis. After I realized that that was not a real option, there was a bit of soul searching. And then what I began to do was to learn everything I could about the ALS space. And what I saw were some amazing people doing amazing things for different reasons. And it became clear to me that there were two types of needs in the fight. Oh, two types of leaders in the fight. Number one were the leaders who wanted to be there. And number two were the leaders, who needed to be there. So that was for me the moment of awakening, where I realized that I needed to be there and I could make a difference.
Well, you've made a difference, tremendous difference already. We'll go into that a little bit more later. But so, Sandra, you became obviously a caregiver to Brian. You had two small children. How did you process all of this in the first 6 to 12 months?
Yeah, it was devastating. As Brian, shared, we had basically just come home from the hospital with our newborn, and we had a 2-year-old. We had no family history, and Brian had some seemingly benign symptoms from, our vantage point, like a weakness and a cramping in his left hand, which resulted in him coming home with what was essentially a death sentence. He was told he might have 6 months left to live, and there was nothing we could do about it, and no one could really help us. And we were shocked, devastated, and terrified. And so, to Brian's point, we really hunkered down for about 6 months or so, just trying to process this. And then we began to think about what we could do, and frankly, what we felt we had an obligation to do.
Well, the first major initiative, at least that I'm aware of, is forming the nonprofit I AM ALS. What kind of were the circumstances that led to that? And then I'd like to ask, what can people do to support I AM ALS?
The way that came about, I remember one day I told Sandra, I think I want to start an ALS nonprofit. And Sandra said to me, I have run 2 nonprofits. If you want to make me involved in the third, you have to fly all around the country and meet with everyone and figure out really what is missing, if anything, and if there is something, how we can help. And what that led to, a realization that we had an amazing network that was able to make DC move in a way that it had never done for ALS. And we also had the chance to reframe the narrative, because what we saw were authentic reasons for hope, but what we saw in the media was hopelessness. So we wanted to make sure that people were able to see the promise in this fight, and to see how if we cure ALS, it will lead to breakthroughs for multiple other neuro diseases. I think that the biggest thing that we want to do, and the best way for people to help, is to sign up to our email listserv. That way they'll be able to take action to help move the fight forward. And it could be 5 minutes every month, or 5 hours every day, or anywhere in between. And that's how we're going to change the course of this fight forever. Yeah, I think, Gary, just to add to what Brian shared, what Brian and I activated with I AM ALS was built on the foundation of what we learned about community organizing on the Obama campaign and in politics and government work in general. And so what we feel so proud of, I think, is both what we've accomplished, but also the sort of process by which we've engaged the ALS community and then the broader community to drive this sort of unprecedented, community organizing in patient advocacy that is making history. And so for us, I AM ALS is that vehicle for community organizing, and we're very strategic about leveraging each new sort of participant's superpower. And to Brian's point, going to iamals.org is the best way to get connected to even a micro action. And as Brian often says, even if you're not affected by ALS, the work we're doing is a way to participate even in micro ways that make you feel good because we're doing something really special. So, you often frame it as like, this is an opportunity to do something great today, and it'll take 3 minutes. And one last thought. One of our volunteers put it best. She said that I AM ALS is a platform for the community to come up with new ideas and then to make them real. Because that is how we empower people to understand that they can be a force for positive change.
Yeah, I think it's clear that as a country, we've spent a lot of time and energy and resources on cancer and heart disease as we should, but we really haven't spent as much time and energy on the neurological diseases. And it seems to me that one significant point about your leadership here is you're definitely raising awareness there. And that gets to your point about everybody's affected really one way or another, maybe not specifically with ALS, but certainly with other neuro diseases. At what point did it occur to you that you could be so successful with the ACT for ALS legislation, $100 million a year over 5 years, recently signed by President Biden? Of course, Singo called you out. At what point did you realize that you could have that kind of success?
In about 2020, we saw multiple therapies that were moving through the drug pipeline. And those therapies were not accessible to the vast majority of ALS patients that are not able to be a part of clinical trials due to exclusion criteria. So what we realized that there was a massive opportunity to do two really important things. Number one is to provide access for those patients and hopefully slow down their disease. And number two was to learn from those patients by doing research on how the therapy was affecting their disease course, which was something, that we had never done before. And that was so important to understanding if a therapy is beneficial for 1 year or 4 years. That's how we were able to craft Act for ALS. And we were able to explain to people there is a massive unmet need here, and that we have the chance to actually help people who have been told that there is no hope.
What are the next steps now that Act for ALS has been passed? What are the next steps in your advocacy activities?
Now that it's been passed, we have to get funding appropriated from Congress. So that is our first priority, to allocate $100 million for this year. We're also working with the FDA and NIH to move the program forward so that they are able to begin as soon as possible. And beyond that, we are working on ARPA-H because we think that presents an amazing opportunity to reimagine many fights, many parts of the research system.
Well, you launched February 1st, so just a few days ago, Synapticure, a company focused on neurological diseases, particularly ALS, to begin with, and launched it with a $6 million investment from Google Ventures, or now GV, known previously as Google Ventures, and other investors. What's the purpose of Synapticure? How did you kind of arrive at the fact that forming a company would be useful at this point?
We saw two things happening. We saw amazing progress in the bench science, in the understanding of ALS and the genetic variants of ALS. But then what we also saw at the same time was that the care system had used the exact same model for nearly 30 years. And that was not incorporating the latest advances in technology and scientific advances. And we began to see, in order to make that come together, we had to create a company that was focused on democratizing care to all patients and having that platform be able to perform the cutting edge testing that patients need to understand their type of ALS and that clinicians need to help advise patients on what treatments and trials may be best for them.
Mm-hmm. Can you review what are the specific services that will be provided by Synapticure?
Yeah. So Synapticure is a full stack teleneurology platform. And we start with care coordination. So for any patient who enrolls They get connected to a care coordinator who is there to create, via telemedicine, care continuity to relieve the administrative burden that Brian and I ourselves have experienced in our own journey. And then to bring these individuals through a course of services that help them, to Brian's point, understand as specifically as they can their subtype of ALS, because the scientific advances have shown us that this is truly a heterogeneous disease. And so we need to start treating it as such. And some of the most promising therapies are targeting specific genetic subtypes. And so as soon as the patient enrolls and gets supported by this care coordinator, they then get taken through a course of genetic counseling, testing. There's additional testing that Synapticure is envisioning bringing online in the near future that can even help further refine our understanding of each patient's individual type of ALS. On top of that, we layer in teleneurology support. And so Synapticure is partnered with an entity, CareND, that is a covered entity that is hiring on an amazing group of teleneurologists that can provide on-demand telemedicine appointments. And as Brian and I both personally experienced, you often want to see your ALS clinician far more frequently than is possible to do in person, or just given the sort of backlog that ALS clinics face. And so through the course of all of these supports of care coordination, of teleneurology, genetic testing and counseling, and a whole host of sort of future offerings that we're imagining together with like-minded caregivers and patients, we think we can make really Synapticure become that first platform and opportunity for ALS patients, and then hopefully, sister diseases to be able to access care more easily, more comprehensively than has been possible before. I think one thing that's important to add to that we are partnering with the leading ALS clinics, and that patients can have the ability to see a doctor in person if they want to or need to, and also have the ability to have more resources from their own home, which does make all the difference in the world. As the disease, ALS progresses, we all become more and more disabled.
Right. You've covered this, but let me ask the question specifically, if I could, just to make sure that we make this point. And that is, from the standpoint of a patient or the patient's caregiver, they plug into Synapticure through a coordinator that they know, they have the name and so on. Is that correct? Did I lay that out properly?
Yes, absolutely. So the care coordinator that they meet at that first appointment is there to stay with the person living with ALS and their caregiver through every step of the journey, right? And so in that way, we want to create really the next level of continuity of care that Brian and I really desperately wanted when we were going through this process, but couldn't find easily. And so that individual supports you through every step, is available whenever you have additional questions, and brings in, as Brian noted, all of these additional resources. And so that could include appointments with the top ALS clinics, including some of our early collaborating clinics, MGH and UCSF, and now several others. That could mean, additional Synapticure teleneurologist visits. That could mean additional testing, clinical trial decision-making support. So really, we're looking to augment everyone's current care and level it up. And these individuals, who are the care coordinators, are nurses and social workers, and a part of the physician practice. So they're part of the team that will actually care for the patient. And that is how we make sure That is how we make sure there is no gap in the care we're hoping to provide.
Right. Is there a disease-specific model that you've seen that could serve as a bit of a model for Synapticure?
We have seen a number of companies that have been started in the oncology space and also in the, one more time? Epilepsy, I'm sorry, space, yes. An ophthalmology space that have used similar models. Mm-hmm. And they've been really successful in meeting the patient where they are and helping the clinician understand what else the patient needs. So the clinician is better able to help the patient. Yeah, and I think to that point, Gary, we're obviously first and foremost focused on how to level up care for ALS patients, but alongside that, we're here to support the ALS clinical community, right? We want more individuals diagnosed with ALS to be seen by those clinicians, because right now, for many patients, traveling to those clinics is cost prohibitive, geographically prohibitive, and then also at the end of the day, these clinics are amazing, but they are really taxed, and they have a lot of patients that are trying to get in the door. So we're also really focused on how we can help ease the burden on our leading clinicians in this, community, nationally speaking, and allow them to see more patients, to bring, more people diagnosed with ALS who are completely left outside of the ALS care ecosystem into this ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to return to a bit of a personal question. As you just think about this, in a few short years, you've formed a successful nonprofit, you've accomplished a major piece of legislation, now you've formed Synapticure company. Where do you get your energy from, you two? That's a serious question. I mean, this is a hell of a several years, I'll tell you. Where do you get your energy from?
For me, there has been power in the purpose. And what I mean by that is, when I was diagnosed, I knew I could no longer serve as a federal prosecutor. And then I knew there would come a time. And I knew there would come a time when I would not be able to be the father that I envisioned being because of physical limitations. So for me, I felt a bit lost. So what this allows me to do is to turn that feeling upside down and to realize that I can actually change the course of this disease. So for me, I am serving, I am driven by necessity, but also a belief that we can make a real difference. And that difference, and that difference may save my life and thousands of others. I mean, Gary, we grew up in public service, so that's sort of how we're built. That's what makes us feel good, right? So in the absence of other things that can make you feel good in a situation like this was the natural thing for us to do that gave us agency and purpose and made us feel good.
Well, you're really making a significant contribution, which is probably making a lot of other people feel good too. So good for you. This has been an awesome interview. Thank you very much. But I have one last question. And that is, we have young leaders, up and coming leaders that watch this show. What advice do you have for younger, up and coming leaders as they think about their career as a leader?
I think the most important thing I can say is number one, do not be afraid to fail. Number two, be humble enough to know that you do not know everything. And if you listen to people, you will learn so much more and become such a better leader than you ever thought possible. That's what I've tried to do. I've failed a lot, but I'm learning.
How do you answer that question, Sandra?
I think I've learned a lot from Brian about being a leader, which is to keep at it and persist as we keep failing and trying again and failing and trying again, because we've ultimately succeeded after a series of failures. And so I think it's also about having a little faith that it can work out or come through in the end. And I think Brian has that hope and faith in spades. And so I've drawn on that through the harder moments of grinding through work. And I think it was something I'd impart to others.
Well, Brian and Sandra, you have our full respect and admiration. It's just terrific what you've accomplished. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having us, Gary. It was a privilege.